This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information and to find out how you can volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Allan Quatermain by H. Rider Haggard. Chapter 5. Umslopogaas makes a promise. Next morning at breakfast I missed Flossie and asked where she was. "Well," said her mother, "when I got up this morning I found a note put outside my door, in which—but here it is, you can read it for yourself," and she gave me the slip of paper on which the following was written: "Dearest M, it is just dawn, and I am off to the hills to get Mr Q a bloom of the lily he wants, so don't expect me till you see me. I have taken the white donkey, and nurse and a couple of boys are coming with me. Also something to eat, as I may be away all day, for I am determined to get the lily if I have to go 20 miles for it. Flossie." "I hope she will be all right," I said, a little anxiously. "I never meant her to trouble after the flower." "Oh, Flossie can look after herself," said her mother. "She often goes off in this way like a true child of the wilderness." But Mr Mackenzie, who came in just then and saw the note for the first time, looked rather grave, though he said nothing. After breakfast was over, I took him aside and asked him whether it would not be possible to send after the girl and get her back, having in view the possibility of there still being some Maasai hanging about, at whose hands she might come to harm. "I fear it would be of no use," he answered. "She may be 15 miles off by now, and it is impossible to say what path she has taken. There are the hills," and he pointed to a long range of rising ground stretching almost parallel with the course followed by the river Tana, but gradually sloping down to a dense, bush-clad plain about 5 miles short of the house. Here I suggested that we might get up the great tree over the house and search the country round with a spyglass, and this, after Mr Mackenzie had given some orders to his people to try and follow Flossie's spoor, we did. The ascent of the mighty tree was rather an alarming performance, even with a sound rope ladder fixed at both ends to climb up, at least to a landsman, but Good came up like a lamplighter. On reaching the height at which the first fern-shaped boughs sprang from the bole, we stepped without any difficulty upon a platform made of boards, nailed from one bough to another, and large enough to accommodate a dozen people. As for the view, it was simply glorious. In every direction the bush rolled away in great billows for miles and miles, as far as the glass would show, only here and there broken by the brighter green of patches of cultivation, or by the glittering surface of lakes. To the northwest Kenya reared his mighty head, and we could trace the Tana River curling like a silver snake almost from his feet and far away beyond us towards the ocean. It is a glorious country, and only wants the hand of civilized man to make it a most productive one. But, look as we would, we could see no signs of Flossie and her donkey, so at last we had to come down disappointed. On reaching the veranda, I found Umslopogaas sitting there, slowly and lightly sharpening his axe with a small whetstone he always carried with him. "What doest thou, Umslopogaas?" I asked. "I smell blood," was the answer, and I could get no more out of him. After dinner we again went up the tree and searched the surrounding country with a spyglass, but without result. When we came down, Umslopogaas was still sharpening Inkosi-kaas, although she already had an edge like a razor. Standing in front of him, and regarding him with a mixture of fear and fascination, was Alphonse, and certainly he did seem an alarming object, sitting there Zulu fashion on his haunches, a wild look upon his intensely savage and yet intellectual face, sharpening, sharpening, sharpening at the murderous-looking axe. "Oh, the monster, the horrible man!" said the little French cook, lifting his hands in amazement. "See but the hole in his head! The skin beats on it up and down like a baby's. Who would nurse such a baby?" And he burst out laughing at the idea. For a moment Umslopogaas looked up from his sharpening, and a sort of evil light played in his dark eyes. "What does the little buffalo heifer," so named by Umslopogaas on account of his mustachios and feminine characteristics, "say? Let him be careful, or I will cut his horns. Beware, little man monkey, beware!" Unfortunately, Alphonse, who was getting over his fear of him, went on laughing, "ce drôle d'un monsieur noir." I was about to warn him to desist, when suddenly the huge Zulu bounded off the veranda on to the open space where Alphonse was standing, his features alive with a sort of malicious enthusiasm, and began swinging the axe round and round over the Frenchman's head. "Stand still!" I shouted. "Do not move as you value your life. He will not hurt you." But I doubt if Alphonse heard me, being, fortunately for himself, almost petrified with horror. Then followed the most extraordinary display of sword, or rather of axemanship, that I ever saw. First of all the axe went flying round and round over the top of Alphonse's head, with an angry whirl and such extraordinary swiftness that it looked like a continuous band of steel, ever getting nearer and yet nearer to that unhappy individual's skull, till at last it grazed it as it flew. Then suddenly the motion was changed, and it seemed to literally flow up and down his body and limbs, never more than an eighth of an inch from them, and yet never striking them. It was a wonderful sight to see the little man fixed there, having apparently realized that to move would be to run the risk of sudden death, while his black tormentor towered over him and wrapped him round with the quick flashes of the axe. For a minute or more this went on, till suddenly I saw the moving brightness travel down the side of Alphonse's face, and then outwards and stop. As it did so, a tuft of something black fell to the ground. It was the tip of one of the little Frenchman's curling mustachios. Umslopogaas leant upon the handle of Inkosi-kaas and broke into a long low laugh, and Alphonse, overcome with fear, sank into a sitting posture on the ground, while we stood astonished at this exhibition of almost superhuman skill and mastery of a weapon. "Inkosi-kaas is sharp enough," he shouted. "The blow that clipped the buffalo heifer's horn would have split a man from the crown to the chin. Few could have struck it but I. None could have struck it and not taken off the shoulder too. Look, thou little heifer. Am I a good man to laugh at, thinkest thou? For a space hast thou stood within a hair's breadth of death. Laugh not again, lest the hair's breadth be wanting. I have spoken." "What meanest thou by such mad tricks?" I asked of Umslopogaas indignantly. "Surely thou art mad. 20 times didst thou go near to slaying the man." "And yet, Macumazahn, I slew not. Thrice, as Inkosi-kaas flew, the spirit entered into me to end him and send her crashing through his skull, but I did not. Nay, it was but a jest, but tell the heifer that it is not well to mock at such as I. Now I go to make a shield, for I smell blood, Macumazahn. Of a truth I smell blood. Before the battle hast thou not seen the vulture grow of a sudden in the sky? They smell the blood, Macumazahn, and my scent is more keen than theirs. There is a dry ox hide down yonder. I go to make a shield. "That is an uncomfortable retainer of yours," said Mr Mackenzie, who had witnessed this extraordinary scene. "He has frightened Alphonse out of his wits. Look!" and he pointed to the Frenchman, who with a scared white face and trembling limbs was making his way into the house. "I don't think that he will ever laugh at le Monsieur Noir again." "Yes," answered I, "it is ill jesting with such as he. When he is roused he is like a fiend, and yet he has a kind heart in his own fierce way. I remember years ago seeing him nurse a sick child for a week. He is a strange character, but true as steel, and a strong stick to rest on in danger." "He says he smells blood," said Mr Mackenzie. "I only trust he is not right. I am getting very fearful about my little girl. She must have gone far, or she would be home by now. It is half past 3 o'clock." I pointed out that she had taken food with her, and very likely would not in the ordinary course of events return till nightfall, but I myself felt very anxious, and feared that my anxiety betrayed itself. Shortly after this, the people whom Mr Mackenzie had sent out to search for Flossie returned, stating that they had followed the spoor of the donkey for a couple of miles, and had then lost it on some stony ground, nor could they discover it again. They had, however, scoured the country far and wide, but without success. After this the afternoon wore drearily on, and towards evening, there still being no signs of Flossie, our anxiety grew very keen. As for the poor mother, she was quite prostrated by her fears, and no wonder, but the father kept his head wonderfully well. Everything that could be done was done. People were sent out in all directions, shots were fired, and a continuous outlook kept from the great tree, but without avail. And then it grew dark, and still no sign of fair-haired little Flossie. At 8 o'clock we had supper. It was but a sorrowful meal, and Mrs Mackenzie did not appear at it. We three also were very silent, for in addition to our natural anxiety as to the fate of the child, we were weighed down by the sense that we had brought this trouble on the head of our kind host. When supper was nearly at an end, I made an excuse to leave the table. I wanted to get outside and think the situation over. I went on to the veranda, and having lit my pipe, sat down on a seat about a dozen feet from the right-hand end of the structure, which was, as the reader may remember, exactly opposite one of the narrow doors of the protecting wall that enclosed the house and flower garden. I had been sitting there perhaps 6 or 7 minutes when I thought I heard the door move. I looked in that direction and I listened, but being unable to make out anything, concluded that I must have been mistaken. It was a darkish night, the moon not having yet risen. Another minute passed, when suddenly something round fell with a soft but heavy thud upon the stone flooring of the veranda, and came bounding and rolling along past me. For a moment I did not rise, but sat wondering what it could be. Finally I concluded it must have been an animal. Just then, however, another idea struck me, and I got up quickly enough. The thing lay quite still a few feet beyond me. I put down my hand towards it, and it did not move. Clearly it was not an animal. My hand touched it. It was soft and warm and heavy. Hurriedly I lifted it and held it up against the faint starlight. It was a newly severed human head. I am an old hand and not easily upset, but I own that that ghastly sight made me feel sick. How had the thing come there? Whose was it? I put it down and ran to the little doorway. I could see nothing, hear nobody. I was about to go out into the darkness beyond, but remembering that to do so was to expose myself to the risk of being stabbed, I drew back, shut the door and bolted it. Then I returned to the veranda, and in as careless a voice as I could command, called Curtis. I fear, however, that my tones must have betrayed me, for not only Sir Henry, but also Good and Mackenzie rose from the table and came hurrying out. "What is it?" said the clergyman anxiously. Then I had to tell them. Mr Mackenzie turned pale as death under his red skin. We were standing opposite the hall door, and there was a light in it so that I could see. He snatched the head up by the hair and held it against the light. "It is the head of one of the men who accompanied Flossie," he said with a gasp. "Thank God it is not hers." We all stood and stared at each other aghast. What was to be done? Just then there was a knocking at the door that I had bolted, and a voice cried, "Open, my father, open!" The door was unlocked, and in sped a terrified man. He was one of the spies who had been sent out. "My father," he cried, "the Maasai are on us. A great body of them have passed round the hill, and are moving towards the old stone kraal down by the little stream. My father, make strong thy heart. In the midst of them I saw the white ass, and on it sat the water lily (Flossie). An Elmoran (young warrior) led the ass, and by its side walked the nurse, weeping. The men who went with her in the morning I saw not." "Was the child alive?" asked Mr Mackenzie hoarsely. "She was white as the snow, but well, my father. They passed quite close to me, and looking up from where I lay hid, I saw her face against the sky." "God help her and us," groaned the clergyman. "How many are there of them?" I asked. "More than 200, 200 and half a hundred." Once more we looked one on the other. What was to be done? Just then there rose a loud insistent cry outside the wall. "Open the door, white man, open the door! A herald to speak with thee!" Thus cried the voice. Umslopogaas ran to the wall, and reaching with his long arms to the coping, lifted his head above it and gazed over. "I see but one man," he said. "He is armed and carries a basket in his hand." "Open the door," I said. "Umslopogaas, take thine axe and stand thereby. Let one man pass. If another follows, slay." The door was unbarred. In the shadow of the wall stood Umslopogaas, his axe raised above his head to strike. Just then the moon came out. There was a moment's pause, and then in stalked a Maasai Elmoran, clad in the full war panoply that I have already described, but bearing a large basket in his hand. The moonlight shone bright upon his great spear as he walked. He was physically a splendid man, apparently about 35 years of age. Indeed, none of the Masai that I saw were under 6 feet high, though mostly quite young. When he got opposite to us, he halted, put down the basket, and stuck the spike of his spear into the ground, so that it stood upright. "Let us talk," he said. "The first messenger we sent to you could not talk," and he pointed to the head which lay upon the paving of the stoep, a ghastly sight in the moonlight. "But I have words to speak if ye have ears to hear. Also I bring presents. and he pointed to the basket and laughed with an air of swaggering insolence that is perfectly indescribable, and yet which one could not but admire, seeing that he was surrounded by enemies. "Say on," said Mr Mackenzie. "I am the Ligonani war captain of a party of the Maasai of the Gwasa Amboni. I and my men followed these three white men," and he pointed to Sir Henry, Good, and myself, "but they were too clever for us and escaped hither. We have a quarrel with them and are going to kill them." "Are you, my friend?" said I to myself. "In following these men we this morning caught two black men, one black woman, a white donkey, and a white girl. One of the black men we killed. There is his head upon the pavement. The other ran away. The black woman, the little white girl, and the white ass we took and brought with us. In proof thereof have I brought this basket that she carried. Is it not thy daughter's basket?" Mr Mackenzie nodded, and the warrior went on. "Good. With thee and thy daughter we have no quarrel, nor do we wish to harm thee, save as to thy cattle, which we have already gathered, 240 head, a beast for every man's father." The Masai Elmoran, or young warriors, can own no property, so all the booty that they may win in battle belongs to their fathers alone. Allan Quatermain. Here Mr Mackenzie gave a groan, as he greatly valued this herd of cattle, which he had bred with much care and trouble. "So, save for the cattle, thou mayest go free, more especially," he added frankly, glancing at the wall, "as this place would be a difficult one to take. But as to these men it is otherwise. We have followed them for nights and days, and must kill them. Were we to return to our kraal without having done so, all the girls would make a mock of us. So, however troublesome it may be, they must die. Now I have a proposition for thee. We would not harm the little girl. She is too fair to harm, and has besides a brave spirit. Give us one of these three men, a life for a life, and we will let her go, and throw in the black woman with her also. This is a fair offer, white man. We ask but for one, not for the three. We must take another opportunity to kill the other two. I do not even pick my man, though I should prefer the big one," pointing to Sir Henry. "He looks strong, and would die more slowly." "And if I say I will not yield the man?" said Mr Mackenzie. "Nay, say not so, white man," answered the Masai, "for then thy daughter dies at dawn, and the woman with her says thou hast no other child. Were she older I would take her for a servant, but as she is so young I will slay her with my own hand, ay, with this very spear. Thou canst come and see, an thou wilt. I give thee safe conduct," and the fiend laughed aloud at his brutal jest. Meanwhile I had been thinking rapidly, as one does in emergencies, and had come to the conclusion that I would exchange myself against Flossie. I scarcely like to mention the matter for fear it should be misunderstood. Pray do not let anyone be misled into thinking that there was anything heroic about this, or any such nonsense. It was merely a matter of common sense and common justice. My life was an old and worthless one, hers was young and valuable. Her death would pretty well kill her father and mother also, whilst nobody would be much the worse for mine. Indeed, several charitable institutions would have cause to rejoice thereat. It was indirectly through me that the dear little girl was in her present position. Lastly, a man was better fitted to meet death in such a peculiarly awful form than a sweet young girl. Not, however, that I meant to let these gentry torture me to death. I'm far too much of a coward to allow that, being naturally a timid man. My plan was to see the girl safely exchanged and then to shoot myself, trusting that the Almighty would take the peculiar circumstances of the case into consideration and pardon the act. All this and more went through my mind in very few seconds. "All right, Mackenzie," I said, "you can tell the man that I will exchange myself against Flossie, only I stipulate that she shall be safely in this house before they kill me." "Eh?" said Sir Henry and Good simultaneously. "That you don't." "No, no," said Mr Mackenzie. "I will have no man's blood upon my hands. If it please God that my daughter should die this awful death, His will be done. You are a brave man, which I am not by any means, and a noble man, Quatermain, but you shall not go." "If nothing else turns up, I shall go," I said decidedly. "This is an important matter," said Mackenzie, addressing the Lygonani, "and we must think it over. You shall have our answer at dawn." "Very well, white man," answered the savage indifferently. "Only remember, if thy answer is late, thy little white bud will never grow into a flower. That is all, for I shall cut it with this," and he touched the spear. "I should have thought that thou wouldst play a trick and attack us at night, but I know from the woman with the girl that your men are down at the coast, and that thou hast but 20 men here. It is not wise, white man," he added with a laugh, "to keep so small a garrison for your boma (kraal). Well, good night, and good night to you also, other white men, whose eyelids I shall soon close once and for all. At dawn thou wilt bring me word. If not, remember it shall be as I have said." Then turning to Umslopogaas, who had all the while been standing behind him, and shepherding him as it were, "Open the door for me, fellow. Quick now." This was too much for the old chief's patience. For the last 10 minutes his lips had been, figuratively speaking, positively watering over the Maasai Lygonani, and this he could not stand. Placing his long hand on the Elmoran's shoulder, he gripped it and gave him such a twist as brought him face to face with himself. Then, thrusting his fierce countenance to within a few inches of the Masai's evil feather-framed features, he said in a low growling voice, "Seest thou me? Ay, fellow, I see thee. And seest thou this?" and he held Inkosi-kaas before his eyes. "Ay, fellow, I see the toy. What of it? Thou Masai dog, thou boasting windbag, thou capturer of little girls, with this toy will I hew thee limb from limb. Well for thee that thou art a herald, or even now I would strew thy members about the grass." The Masai shook his great spear and laughed loud and long as he answered, "I would that thou stoodest against me man to man, and we would see." And again he turned to go, still laughing. "Thou shalt stand against me man to man, be not afraid," replied Umslopogaas, still in the same ominous voice. "Thou shalt stand face to face with Umslopogaas, of the blood of Chaka, of the people of the Amazulu, a captain in the regiment of the Nkomabakosi, as many have done before, and bow thyself to Inkosi-kaas as many have done before. Ay, laugh on, laugh on. Tomorrow night shall the jackals laugh as they crunch thy ribs." When the Lygonani had gone, one of us thought of opening the basket he had brought as a proof that Flossie was really their prisoner. On lifting the lid, it was found to contain a most lovely specimen of both bulb and flower of the Goya lily, which I have already described, in full bloom and quite uninjured, and what was more, a note in Flossie's childish hand, written in pencil upon a greasy piece of paper that had been used to wrap up some food in. "Dearest father and mother," ran the note, "the Maasai caught us when we were coming home with the lily. I tried to escape but could not. They killed Tom. The other man ran away. They have not hurt nurse and me, but they say they mean to exchange us against one of Mr Quatermain's party. I will have nothing of the sort. Do not let anybody give his life for me. Try and attack them at night. They are going to feast on 3 bullocks they have stolen and killed. I have my pistol, and if no help comes by dawn, I will shoot myself. They shall not kill me. If so, remember me always, dearest father and mother. I am very frightened, but I trust in God. I dare not write any more, as they are beginning to notice. Goodbye, Flossie." Scrawled across the outside of this was, "Love to Mr Quatermain. They are going to take the basket, so he will get the lily." When I read those words, written by that brave little girl in an hour of danger sufficiently near and horrible to have turned the brain of a strong man, I own I wept, and once more in my heart I vowed that she should not die while my life could be given to save her. Then eagerly, quickly, almost fiercely, we fell to discussing the situation. Again I said that I would like to go, and Mr Mackenzie negatived it, and Curtis and Good, like the true man that they are, vowed that if I did they would go with me, and die back to back with me. "It is," I said at last, "absolutely necessary that an effort of some sort should be made before the morning." "Then let us attack them with what force we can muster and take our chance," said Sir Henry. "Ay, ay," growled Umslopogaas in Zulu. "Spoken like a man, Incubu. What is there to be afraid of? 250 Masai, forsooth. How many are we? The chief there, Mr Mackenzie, has 20 men, and thou, Macumazahn, hast 5 men, and there are also 5 white men, that is 30 men in all. Enough, enough. Listen now, Macumazahn, thou who art very clever and old in war. What says the maid? These men eat and make merry. Let it be their funeral feast. What said the dog whom I hope to hew down at daybreak? That he feared no attack because we were so few. Knowest thou the old kraal where the men have camped? I saw it this morning. It is thus," and he drew an oval on the floor. "Here is the big entrance, filled up with thorn bushes, and opening on to a steep rise. Why, Incubu, thou and I, with axes, will hold it against 100 men striving to break out. Look now, thus shall the battle go. Just as the light begins to glint upon the oxen's horns, not before, or it will be too dark, and not later, or they will be awakening and perceive us. Let Bougwan creep round with 10 men to the top end of the kraal, where the narrow entrance is. Let them silently slay the sentry there so that he makes no sound, and stand ready. Then, Incubu, let thee and me and one of the Askari, the one with the broad chest, he is a brave man, creep to the wide entrance that is filled with thorn bushes, and there also slay the sentry, and armed with battle axes take our stand, also one on each side of the pathway, and one a few paces beyond, to deal with such as pass the twain at the gate. It is there that the rush will come. That will leave 16 men. Let these men be divided into 2 parties, with one of which shalt thou go, Macumazahn, and with one the praying man, Mr Mackenzie, and all armed with rifles. Let them make their way, one to the right side of the kraal, and one to the left. And when thou, Macumazahn, lowest like an ox, all shall open fire with the guns upon the sleeping men, being very careful not to hit the little maid. Then shall Bougwan at the far end, and his 10 men, raise the war cry, and springing over the wall put the Maasai there to the sword. And it shall happen that, being yet heavy with food and sleep, and bewildered by the firing of the guns, the falling of men, and the spears of Bougwan, the soldiers shall rise and rush like wild game towards the thorn-stopped entrance, and there the bullets from either side shall plough through them, and there shall Incubu and the Askari and I wait for those who break across. Such is my plan, Macumazahn. If thou hast a better, name it." When he had done, I explained to the others such portions of his scheme as they had failed to understand, and they all joined with me in expressing the greatest admiration of the acute and skilful programme devised by the old Zulu, who was indeed in his own savage fashion the finest general I ever knew. After some discussion we determined to accept the scheme as it stood, it being the only one possible under the circumstances, and giving the best chance of success that such a forlorn hope would admit of, which, however, considering the enormous odds and the character of our foe, was not very great. "Ah, old lion," I said to Umslopogaas, "thou knowest how to lie in wait as well as how to bite, where to seize as well as where to hang on." "Ay, ay, Macumazahn," he answered, "for 30 years have I been a warrior, and have seen many things. It will be a good fight. I smell blood. I tell thee, I smell blood." End of chapter 5. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information and to find out how you can volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Allan Quatermain by H. Rider Haggard. Chapter 6. The Night Wears On. As may be imagined, at the very first sign of a Maasai, the entire population of the mission station had sought refuge inside the stout stone wall, and were now to be seen, men, women, and countless children, huddled up together in little groups, and all talking at once in awed tones of the awfulness of Maasai manners and customs, and of the fate that they had to expect if those bloodthirsty savages succeeded in getting over the stone wall. Immediately after we had settled upon the outline of our plan of action, as suggested by Umslopogaas, Mr Mackenzie sent for 4 sharp boys of from 12 to 15 years of age, and dispatched them to various points where they could keep an outlook upon the Maasai camp, with others to report from time to time what was going on. Other lads, and even women, were stationed at intervals along the wall in order to guard against the possibility of surprise. After this, the 20 men who formed his whole available fighting force were summoned by our host into the square formed by the house, and there, standing by the bole of the great conifer, he earnestly addressed them and our four Askari. Indeed, it formed a very impressive scene, one not likely to be forgotten by anybody who witnessed it. Immediately by the tree stood the angular form of Mr Mackenzie, one arm outstretched as he talked, and the other resting against the giant bole, his hat off, and his plain but kindly face clearly betraying the anguish of his mind. Next to him was his poor wife, who, seated on a chair, had her face hidden in her hand. On the other side of her was Alphonse, looking exceedingly uncomfortable, and behind him stood the three of us, with Umslopogaas' grim and towering form in the background, resting as usual on his axe. In front stood and squatted the group of armed men, some with rifles in their hands and others with spears and shields, following with eager attention every word that fell from the speaker's lips. The white light of the moon, peering in beneath the lofty boughs, threw a strange wild glamour over the scene, whilst the melancholy soughing of the night wind passing through the millions of pine needles overhead added a sadness of its own to what was already a sufficiently tragic occasion. "Men," said Mr Mackenzie, after he had put all the circumstances of the case fully and clearly before them, and explained to them the proposed plan of our forlorn hope, "men, for years I have been a good friend to you, protecting you, teaching you, guarding you and yours from harm, and ye have prospered with me. Ye have seen my child, the water lily as ye call her, grow year by year, from tenderest infancy to tender childhood, and from childhood on towards maidenhood. She has been your children's playmate. She has helped to tend you when sick, and ye have loved her." "We have," said a deep voice, "and we will die to save her." "I thank you from my heart, I thank you. Sure am I that now, in this hour of darkest trouble, now that her young life is like to be cut off by cruel and savage men, who of a truth know not what they do, ye will strive your best to save her, and to save me and her mother from broken hearts. Think, too, of your own wives and children. If she dies, her death will be followed by an attack upon us here, and at the best, even if we hold our own, your houses and gardens will be destroyed, and your goods and cattle swept away. I am, as ye well know, a man of peace. Never in all these years have I lifted my hand to shed man's blood. But now I say strike, strike, in the name of God, who bade us protect our lives and homes. Swear to me," he went on with added fervour, "swear to me that whilst a man of you remains alive ye will strive your uttermost with me and with these brave white men to save the child from a bloody and cruel death." "Say no more, my father," said the same deep voice that belonged to a stalwart elder of the mission. "We swear it. May we and ours die the death of dogs, and our bones be thrown to the jackals and the kites, if we break the oath. It is a fearful thing to do, my father, so few to strike at so many, yet we will do it, or die in the doing, we swear." "Ay, thus say we all," chimed in the others. "Thus say we all," said I. "It is well," went on Mr Mackenzie. "Ye are true men and not broken reeds to lean on. And now, friends, white and black together, let us kneel and offer up our humble supplication to the throne of power, praying that He in the hollow of whose hands lie all our lives, who giveth life and giveth death, may be pleased to make strong our arms, that we may prevail in what awaits us at the morning's light." And he knelt down, an example that we all followed except Umslopogaas, who stood still in the background, grimly leaning on Inkosi kaas. The fierce old Zulu had no gods and worshipped naught, unless it were his battle axe. "O God of gods," began the clergyman, his deep voice, tremulous with emotion, echoing up in the silence even to the leafy roof, "protector of the oppressed, refuge of those in danger, guardian of the helpless, hear thou our prayer. Almighty Father, to thee we come in supplication, hear thou our prayer. Behold, one child hast thou given us, an innocent child, nurtured in thy knowledge, and now she lies beneath the shadow of the sword, in danger of a fearful death at the hands of savage men. Be with her now, O God, and comfort her. Save her, O Heavenly Father. O God of battle, who teacheth our hands to war and our fingers to fight, in whose strength are hid the destinies of men, be thou with us in the hour of strife. When we go forth into the shadow of death, make thou us strong to conquer. Breathe thou upon our foes and scatter them. Turn thou their strength to water, and bring their high-blown pride to naught. Compass us about with thy protection. Throw over us the shield of thy power. Forget us not now in the hour of our sore distress. Help us now that the cruel man would dash our little ones against the stones. Hear thou our prayer. And for those of us who, kneeling now on earth in health before thee, shall at the sunrise adore thy presence on thy throne, hear our prayer. Make them clean, O God. Wash away their offences in the blood of the Lamb, and when their spirits pass, O receive thou them into the haven of the just. Go forth, O Father, go forth with us into the battle, as with the Israelites of old. O God of battle, hear thou our prayer." He ceased, and after a moment's silence we all rose, and then began our preparations in good earnest. As Umslopogaas said, it was time to stop talking and get to business. The men who were to form each little party were carefully selected, and still more carefully and minutely instructed as to what was to be done. After much consideration it was agreed that the 10 men led by Good, whose duty it was to stampede the camp, were not to carry firearms, that is, with the exception of Good himself, who had a revolver as well as a short sword, the Maasai sime, which I had taken from the body of our poor servant who was murdered in the canoe. We feared that if they had firearms the result of 3 crossfires carried on at once would be that some of our own people would be shot. Besides, it appeared to all of us that the work they had to do would best be carried out with cold steel, especially to Umslopogaas, who was indeed a great advocate of cold steel. We had with us 4 Winchester repeating rifles, besides half a dozen Martinis. I armed myself with one of the repeaters, my own, an excellent weapon for this kind of work, where great rapidity of fire is desirable, and fitted with ordinary flap sights instead of the cumbersome sliding mechanism which they generally have. Mr Mackenzie took another, and the 2 remaining ones were given to 2 of his men who understood the use of them and were noted shots. The martinis and some rifles of Mr Mackenzie's were served out, together with a plentiful supply of ammunition, to the other natives who were to form the two parties whose duty it was to be to open fire from separate sides of the kraal on the sleeping Maasai, and who were fortunately all more or less accustomed to the use of a gun. As for Umslopogaas, we know how he was armed, with an axe. It may be remembered that he, Sir Henry, and the strongest of the Askari were to hold the thorn-stopped entrance to the kraal against the anticipated rush of men striving to escape. Of course, for such a purpose as this, guns were useless. Therefore Sir Henry and the Askari proceeded to arm themselves in like fashion. It so happened that Mr Mackenzie had in his little store a selection of the very best and English-made hammer-backed axe heads. Sir Henry selected one of these, weighing about 2½ pounds and very broad in the blade, and the Askari took another a size smaller. After Umslopogaas had put an extra edge on these two axe heads, we fixed them to 3 feet 6 helves, of which Mr Mackenzie fortunately had some in stock, made of a light but exceedingly tough native wood, something like English ash, only more springy. When 2 suitable helves had been selected with great care, and the ends of the hafts notched to prevent the hand from slipping, the axe heads were fixed on them as firmly as possible, and the weapons immersed in a bucket of water for half an hour. The result of this was to swell the wood in the socket in such a fashion that nothing short of burning would get it out again. When this important matter had been attended to by Umslopogaas, I went into my room and proceeded to open a little tin-lined deal case which contained, what do you think, nothing more or less than 4 male shirts. It had happened to us three on a previous journey that we had made in another part of Africa to owe our lives to iron shirts of native make, and remembering this, I had suggested before we started on our present hazardous expedition that we should have some made to fit us. There was a little difficulty about this, as armour making is pretty well an extinct art, but they can do most things in the way of steel work in Birmingham if they are put to it, and you will pay the price. And the end of it was that they turned out the loveliest steel shirts it is possible to see. The workmanship was exceedingly fine, the web being composed of thousands upon thousands of stout but tiny rings of the best steel made. These shirts, or rather steel-sleeved and high-necked jerseys, were lined with ventilated wash leather, were not bright, but brown like the barrel of a gun, and mine weighed exactly 7 pounds and fitted me so well that I found I could wear it for days next to my skin without being chafed. Sir Henry had 2, one of the ordinary make, that is to say a jersey with little dependent flaps meant to afford some protection to the upper part of the thighs, and another of his own design, fashioned on the pattern of the garments advertised as combinations, and weighing 12 pounds. This combination shirt, of which the seat was made of wash leather, protected the whole body down to the knees, but was rather more cumbersome, inasmuch as it had to be laced up at the back, and of course involved some extra weight. With these shirts were what looked like 4 brown cloth travelling caps with earpieces. Each of these caps was, however, quilted with steel links so as to afford a most valuable protection for the head. It seems almost laughable to talk of steel shirts in these days of bullets, against which they are of course quite useless, but where one has to do with savages armed with cutting weapons such as assegais or battle axes, they afford the most valuable protection, being, if well made, quite invulnerable to them. I have often thought that if only the English government had in our savage wars, and more especially in the Zulu war, thought fit to serve out light steel shirts, there would be many a man alive today who, as it is dead and forgotten. To return. On the present occasion we blessed our foresight in bringing these shirts, and also our good luck, in that they had not been stolen by our rascally bearers when they ran away with our goods. As Curtis had two, and after considerable deliberation had made up his mind to wear his combination one himself, the extra 3 or 4 pounds weight being a matter of no account to so strong a man, and the protection afforded to the thighs being a very important matter to a fighting man not armed with a shield of any kind, I suggested that he should lend the other to Umslopogaas, who was to share the danger and the glory of his post. He readily consented, and called the Zulu who came bearing Sir Henry's axe, which he had now fixed up to his satisfaction, with him. When we showed him the steel shirt and explained to him that we wanted him to wear it, he at first declined, saying that he had fought in his own skin for 30 years, and that he was not going to begin now to fight in an iron one. Thereupon I took a heavy spear, and spreading the shirt upon the floor, drove the spear down upon it with all my strength, the weapon rebounding without leaving a mark upon the tempered steel. This exhibition half converted him, and when I pointed out to him how necessary it was that he should not let any old-fashioned prejudices he might possess stand in the way of a precaution which might preserve a valuable life at a time when men were scarce, and also that if he wore this shirt he might dispense with a shield, and so have both hands free, he yielded at once, and proceeded to invest his frame with the iron skin. And indeed, although made for Sir Henry, it fitted the great Zulu like a skin. The two men were almost of a height, and though Curtis looked the bigger man, I am inclined to think that the difference was more imaginary than real, the fact being that, although he was plumper and rounder, he was not really bigger except in the arms. Umslopogaas had, comparatively speaking, thin arms, but they were as strong as wire ropes. At any rate, when they both stood, axe in hand, invested in the brown mail, which clung to their mighty forms like a web garment, showing the swell of every muscle and the curve of every line, they formed a pair that any 10 men might shrink from meeting. It was now nearly 1 o'clock in the morning, and the spies reported that, after having drunk the blood of the oxen and eaten enormous quantities of meat, the Maasai were going to sleep round their watchfires, but that sentries had been posted at each opening of the kraal. Flossie, they added, was sitting not far from the wall in the centre of the western side of the kraal, and by her were the nurse and the white donkey, which was tethered to a peg. Her feet were bound with a rope, and warriors were lying all round her. As there was absolutely nothing further that could be done then, we all took some supper, and went to lie down for a couple of hours. I could not help admiring the way in which old Umslopogaas flung himself upon the floor, and, unmindful of what was hanging over him, instantly sank into a deep sleep. I do not know how it was with the others, but I could not do as much. Indeed, as is usual with me on these occasions, I am sorry to say that I felt rather frightened, and now that some of the enthusiasm had gone out of me, and I began to calmly contemplate what we had undertaken to do, truth compels me to add that I did not like it. We were but 30 men all told, a good many of whom were no doubt quite unused to fighting, and we were going to engage 250 of the fiercest, bravest, and most formidable savages in Africa, who, to make matters worse, were protected by a stone wall. It was, indeed, a mad undertaking, and what made it even madder was the exceeding improbability of our being able to take up our positions without attracting the notice of the sentries. Of course, if we once did that, and any slight accident, such as the chance discharge of a gun, might do it, we were done for, for the whole camp would be up in a second, and our only hope lay in surprise. The bed whereupon I lay indulging in these uncomfortable reflections was near an open window that looked out on to the veranda, through which came an extraordinary sound of groaning and weeping. For a time I could not make out what it was, but at last I got up, and putting my head out of the window stared about. Presently I saw a dim figure kneeling on the end of the veranda and beating his breast, in which I recognized Alphonse. Not being able to understand his French talk or what on earth he was at, I called to him and asked what he was doing. "Ah, monsieur," he sighed, "I do make prayer for the souls of those whom I shall slay tonight." "Indeed," I said, "then I wish that you would do it a little more quietly." Alphonse retreated, and I heard no more of his groans. And so the time passed, till at length Mr Mackenzie called me in a whisper through the window, for of course everything had now to be done in the most absolute silence. "3 o'clock," he said. "We must begin to move at 1/2 past." I told him to come in, and presently he entered, and I am bound to say that if it had not been that just then I had not got a laugh anywhere about me, I should have exploded at the sight he presented armed for battle. To begin with, he had on a clergyman's black swallow tail, and a kind of broad-rimmed black felt hat, both of which he had donned on account, he said, of their dark colour. In his hand was the Winchester repeating rifle we had lent him, and stuck in an elastic cricketing belt, like those worn by English boys, were first a huge buckhorn-handled carving knife with a guard to it, and next a long-barrelled Colt's revolver. "Ah, my friend," he said, seeing me staring at his belt, "you are looking at my carver. I thought it might come in handy if we came to close quarters. It is excellent steel, and many is the pig I have killed with it." By this time everybody was up and dressing. I put on a light Norfolk jacket over my mail shirt in order to have a pocket handy to hold my cartridges, and buckled on my revolver. Good did the same, but Sir Henry put on nothing except his mail shirt, steel-lined cap, and a pair of veldschoons, or soft hide shoes, his legs being bare from the knees down. His revolver he strapped on round his middle outside the armoured shirt. Meanwhile Umslopogaas was mustering the men in the square under the big tree, and going the rounds to see that each was properly armed, etc. At the last moment we made one change. Finding that 2 of the men who were to have gone with the firing parties knew little or nothing of guns, but were good spearsmen, we took away their rifles, supplied them with shields and long spears of the Maasai pattern, and took them off to join Curtis, Umslopogaas, and the Askari in holding the wide opening, it having become clear to us that 3 men, however brave and strong, were too few for the work. End of chapter 6. LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information and to find out how you can volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Allan Quatermain by H. Rider Haggard. Chapter 7. A Slaughter Grim and Great. Then there was a pause, and we stood there in the chilly, silent darkness, waiting till the moment came to start. It was, perhaps, the most trying time of all, that slow, slow quarter of an hour. The minutes seemed to drag along with leaden feet, and the quiet, the solemn hush that brooded over all, big as it were with a coming fate, was most oppressive to the spirits. I once remember having to get up before dawn to see a man hanged, and I then went through a very similar set of sensations, only in the present instance my feelings were animated by that more vivid and personal element which naturally appertains rather to the person to be operated on than to the most sympathetic spectator. The solemn faces of the men, well aware that the short passage of an hour would mean for some, and perhaps all of them, the last great passage to the unknown or oblivion. The bated whispers in which they spoke. Even Sir Henry's continuous and thoughtful examination of his woodcutter's axe, and the fidgety way in which Good kept polishing his eyeglass, all told the same tale of nerves stretched pretty nigh to breaking point. Only Umslopogaas, leaning as usual upon Inkosi-kaas and taking an occasional pinch of snuff, was to all appearance perfectly and completely unmoved. Nothing could touch his iron nerves. The moon went down. For a long while she had been getting nearer and nearer to the horizon. Now she finally sank and left the world in darkness, save for a faint grey tinge in the eastern sky that palely heralded the dawn. Mr Mackenzie stood, watch in hand, his wife clinging to his arm and striving to stifle her sobs. 20 minutes to 4, he said. It ought to be light enough to attack at 20 minutes past 4. Captain Good had better be moving. He will want 3 or 4 minutes' start. Good gave one final polish to his eyeglass, nodded to us in a jocular sort of way, which I could not help feeling it must have cost him something to muster up, and, ever polite, took off his steel-lined cap to Mrs Mackenzie and started for his position at the head of the kraal, to reach which he had to make a detour by some paths known to the natives. Just then one of the boys came in and reported that everybody in the Maasai camp, with the exception of the 2 sentries who were walking up and down in front of their respective entrances, appeared to be fast asleep. Then the rest of us took the road. First came the guide, then Sir Henry, Umslopogaas, the Wakwafi Askari, and Mr Mackenzie's 2 mission natives armed with long spears and shields. I followed immediately after with Alphonse and 5 natives, all armed with guns, and Mr Mackenzie brought up the rear with the 6 remaining natives. The cattle kraal, where the Masai were camped, lay at the foot of the hill on which the house stood, or, roughly speaking, about 800 yards from the mission buildings. The first 500 yards of this distance we traversed quietly indeed, but at a good pace. After that we crept forward as silently as a leopard on his prey, gliding like ghosts from bush to bush and stone to stone. When I had gone a little way I chanced to look behind me, and saw the redoubtable Alphonse staggering along with white face and trembling knees, and his rifle, which was at full cock, pointed directly at the small of my back. Having halted and carefully put the rifle at safety, we started again, and all went well till we were within 100 yards or so of the kraal, when his teeth began to chatter in the most aggressive way. "If you don't stop that, I will kill you," I whispered savagely, for the idea of having all our lives sacrificed to a tooth-chattering cook was too much for me. I began to fear that he would betray us, and heartily wished we had left him behind. "But, monsieur, I cannot help it," he answered. "It is the cold." Here was a dilemma, but fortunately I devised a plan. In the pocket of the coat I had on was a small piece of dirty rag that I had used some time before to clean a gun with. "Put this in your mouth," I whispered again, giving him the rag, "and if I hear another sound you are a dead man." I knew that that would stifle the clatter of his teeth. I must have looked as if I meant what I said, for he instantly obeyed me, and continued his journey in silence. Then we crept on again. At last we were within 50 yards of the kraal. Between us and it was an open space of sloping grass, with only one mimosa bush and a couple of tussocks of a sort of thistle for cover. We were still hidden in fairly thick bush. It was beginning to grow light. The stars had paled, and a sickly gleam played about the east and was reflected on the earth. We could see the outline of the kraal clearly enough, and could also make out the faint glimmer of the dying embers of the Maasai campfires. We halted and watched, for the sentry we knew was posted at the opening. Presently he appeared, a fine tall fellow, walking idly up and down, within 5 paces of the thorn-stopped entrance. We had hoped to catch him napping, but it was not to be. He seemed particularly wide awake. If we could not kill that man, and kill him silently, we were lost. There we crouched and watched him. Presently Umslopogaas, who was a few paces ahead of me, turned and made a sign, and next second I saw him go down on his stomach like a snake, and taking an opportunity when the sentry's head was turned, began to work his way through the grass without a sound. The unconscious sentry commenced to hum a little tune, and Umslopogaas crept on. He reached the shelter of the mimosa bush unperceived, and there waited. Still the sentry walked up and down. Presently he turned and looked over the wall into the camp. Instantly the human snake who was stalking him glided on 10 yards, and got behind one of the tussocks of the thistle-like plant, reaching it as the Elmoran turned again. As he did so his eye fell upon this patch of thistles, and it seemed to strike him that it did not look quite right. He advanced a pace towards it, halted, yawned, stooped down, picked up a little pebble, and threw it at it. It hit Umslopogaas upon the head, luckily not upon the armour shirt. Had it done so the clink would have betrayed us. Luckily, too, the shirt was browned and not bright steel, which would certainly have been detected. Apparently satisfied that there was nothing wrong, he then gave over his investigations and contented himself with leaning on his spear and standing gazing idly at the tuft. For at least 3 minutes did he stand thus, plunged apparently in a gentle reverie, and there we lay in the last extremity of anxiety, expecting every moment that we should be discovered, or that some untoward accident would happen. I could hear Alphonse's teeth going like anything on the oiled rag, and turning my head round made an awful face at him. But I am bound to state that my own heart was at much the same game as the Frenchman's castanets, while the perspiration was pouring from my body, causing the washed leather-lined shirt to stick to me unpleasantly, and altogether I was in the pitiable state known by schoolboys as a blue fright. At last the ordeal came to an end. The sentry glanced at the east, and appeared to note with satisfaction that his period of duty was coming to an end, as indeed it was, once and for all, for he rubbed his hands and began to walk again briskly to warm himself. The moment his back was turned, the long black snake glided on again, and reached the other thistle tuft, which was within a couple of paces of his return beat. Back came the sentry and strolled right past the tuft, utterly unconscious of the presence that was crouching behind it. Had he looked down he could scarcely have failed to see, but he did not do so. He passed, and then his hidden enemy erected himself and with outstretched hand followed in his tracks. A moment more, and just as the Elmoran was about to turn, the great Zulu made a spring, and in the growing light we could see his long lean hands close round the Masai's throat. Then followed a convulsive twining of the two dark bodies, and in another second I saw the Masai's head bent back, and heard a sharp crack, something like that of a dry twig snapping, and he fell down upon the ground, his limbs moving spasmodically. Umslopogaas had put out all his iron strength and broken the warrior's neck. For a moment he knelt upon his victim, still gripping his throat, till he was sure that there was nothing more to fear from him, and then he rose and beckoned to us to advance, which we did on all fours, like a colony of huge apes. On reaching the kraal, we saw that the Masai had still further choked this entrance, which was about 10 feet wide, no doubt in order to guard against attack, by dragging 4 or 5 tops of mimosa trees up to it. So much the better for us, I reflected. The more obstruction there was, the slower they would be able to come through. Here we separated, Mackenzie and his party creeping up under the shadow of the wall to the left, while Sir Henry and Umslopogaas took their stations, one on each side of the thorn fence, the 2 spearmen and the Askari lying down in front of it. I and my men crept on up the right side of the kraal, which was about 50 paces long. When I was 2/3 up, I halted, and placed my men at distances of 4 paces from one another, keeping Alphonse close to me, however. Then I peeped for the first time over the wall. It was getting fairly light now, and the first thing I saw was the white donkey, exactly opposite to me, and close by it I could make out the pale face of little Flossie, who was sitting as the lad had described, some 10 paces from the wall. Round her lay many warriors, sleeping. At distances all over the surface of the kraal were the remains of fires, round each of which slept some 25 Maasai, for the most part gorged with food. Now and then a man would raise himself, yawn, and look at the east, which was turning primrose, but none got up. I determined to wait another 5 minutes, both to allow the light to increase so that we could make better shooting, and to give Good and his party, of whom we could see or hear nothing, every opportunity to make ready. The quiet dawn began to throw her ever-widening mantle over plain and forest and river. Mighty Kenya, wrapped in the silence of eternal snows, looked out across the earth, till presently a beam from the unrisen sun lit upon his heaven-kissing crest and purpled it with blood. The sky above grew blue and tender as a mother's smile. A bird began to pipe his morning song, and a little breeze passing through the bush shook down the dewdrops in millions to refresh the waking world. Everywhere was peace and the happiness of a rising strength, everywhere save in the heart of cruel man. Suddenly, just as I was nerving myself for the signal, having already selected my man on whom I meant to open fire, a great fellow sprawling on the ground within 3 feet of little Flossie, Alphonse's teeth began to chatter again like the hoofs of a galloping giraffe, making a great noise in the silence. The rag had dropped out in the agitation of his mind. Instantly a Masai within 3 paces of us woke, and sitting up gazed about him, looking for the cause of the sound. Moved beyond myself, I brought the butt end of my rifle down onto the pit of the Frenchman's stomach. This stopped his chattering, but as he doubled up, he managed to let off his gun in such a manner that the bullet passed within an inch of my head. There was no need for a signal now. From both sides of the kraal broke out a waving line of fire, in which I myself joined, managing with a snapshot to knock over my Masai by Flossie just as he was jumping up. Then from the top end of the kraal there rang an awful yell, in which I rejoiced to recognize Good's piercing notes rising clear and shrill above the din, and in another second followed such a scene as I have never seen before nor shall again. With a universal howl of terror and fury, the brawny crowd of savages within the kraal sprang to their feet, many of them to fall again beneath our well-directed hail of lead before they had moved a yard. For a moment they stood undecided, and then, hearing the cries and curses that rose unceasingly from the top end of the kraal, and bewildered by the storm of bullets, they, as by one impulse, rushed down towards the thorn-stopped entrance. As they went, we kept pouring our fire with terrible effect into the thickening mob as fast as we could load. I had emptied my repeater of the 10 shots it contained, and was just beginning to slip in some more when I bethought me of little Flossie. Looking up, I saw that the white donkey was lying kicking, having been knocked over either by one of our bullets or a Maasai spear thrust. There were no living Maasai near, but the black nurse was on her feet, and with a spear cutting the rope that bound Flossie's feet. Next second she ran to the wall of the kraal and began to climb over it, an example which the little girl followed. But Flossie was evidently very stiff and cramped, and could only go slowly, and as she went, 2 Maasai flying down the kraal caught sight of her and rushed towards her to kill her. The first fellow came up just as the poor little girl, after a desperate effort to climb the wall, fell back into the kraal. Up flashed the great spear, and as it did so a bullet from my rifle found its home in the holder's ribs, and over he went like a shot rabbit. But behind him was the other man, and alas, I had only that one cartridge in the magazine. Flossie had scrambled to her feet and was facing the second man, who was advancing with raised spear. I turned my head aside and felt sick as death. I could not bear to see him stab her. Glancing up again, to my surprise, I saw the Maasai's spear lying on the ground, while the man himself was staggering about with both hands to his head. Suddenly I saw a puff of smoke proceeding apparently from Flossie, and the man fell down headlong. Then I remembered the Derringer pistol she carried, and saw that she had fired both barrels of it at him, thereby saving her life. In another instant she had made an effort, and assisted by the nurse, who was lying on the top, had scrambled over the wall, and I knew that she was, comparatively speaking, safe. All this takes time to tell, but I do not suppose that it took more than 15 seconds to enact. I soon got the magazine of the repeater filled again with cartridges, and once more opened fire, not on the seething black mass which was gathering at the end of the kraal, but on fugitives who bethought them to climb the wall. I picked off several of these men, moving down towards the end of the kraal as I did so, and arriving at the corner, or rather the bend of the oval, in time to see, and by means of my rifle to assist in, the mighty struggle that took place there. By this time some 200 Maasai, allowing that we had up to the present accounted for 50, had gathered together in front of the thorn-stopped entrance, driven thither by the spears of Good's men, whom they doubtless supposed were a large force instead of being but 10 strong. For some reason it never occurred to them to try and rush the wall, which they could have scrambled over with comparative ease. They all made for the fence, which was really a strongly interwoven fortification. With a bound the first warrior went at it, and even before he touched the ground on the other side I saw Sir Henry's great axe swing up and fall with awful force upon his feather headpiece, and he sank into the middle of the thorns. Then with a yell and a crash they began to break through as they might, and ever as they came the great axe swung, and Inkosi-kaas flashed, and they fell dead, one by one, each man thus helping to build up a barrier against his fellows. Those who escaped the axes of the pair fell at the hands of the Askari and the two mission Kafirs, and those who passed scatheless from them were brought low by my own and Mackenzie's fire. Faster and more furious grew the fighting. Single Maasai would spring upon the dead bodies of their comrades and engage one or the other of the axemen with their long spears. But, thanks chiefly to the male shirts, the result was always the same. Presently there was a great swing of the axe, a crashing sound, and another dead Maasai. That is, if the man was engaged with Sir Henry. If it was Umslopogaas that he fought with, the result indeed would be the same, but it would be differently attained. It was but rarely that the Zulu used the crashing double-handed stroke. On the contrary, he did little more than tap continually at his adversary's head, pecking at it with the pole-axe end of the axe as a woodpecker pecks at rotten wood. End note. As I think I have already said, one of Umslopogaas's Zulu names was the woodpecker. I could never make out why he was called so until I saw him in action with Inkosi-kaas, when I at once recognized the resemblance. Allan Quatermain. Presently a peck would go home, and his enemy would drop down with a neat little circular hole in his forehead or skull, exactly similar to that which a cheese scoop makes in a cheese. He never used the broad blade of the axe except when hard pressed or when striking at a shield. He told me afterwards that he did not consider it sportsmanlike. Good and his men were quite close by now, and our people had to cease firing into the mass for fear of killing some of them. As it was, one of them was slain in this way. Mad and desperate with fear, the Maasai, by a frantic effort, burst through the thorn fence and piled up dead, and sweeping Curtis, Umslopogaas, and the other three before them into the open. And now it was that we began to lose men fast. Down went our poor Askari, who was armed with the axe, a great spear standing out a foot behind his back, and before long the two spearsmen who had stood with him went down too, dying fighting like tigers, and others of our party shared their fate. For a moment I feared the fight was lost. Certainly it trembled in the balance. I shouted to my men to cast down their rifles and to take spears and throw themselves into the melee. They obeyed, their blood being now thoroughly up, and Mr Mackenzie's people followed their example. This move had a momentary good result, but still the fight hung in the balance. Our people fought magnificently, hurling themselves upon the dark mass of El Moran, hewing, thrusting, slaying, and being slain. And ever above the din rose Good's awful yell of encouragement as he plunged to wherever the fight was thickest, and ever with an almost machine-like regularity the two axes rose and fell, carrying death and disablement at every stroke. But I could see that the strain was beginning to tell upon Sir Henry, who was bleeding from several flesh wounds. His breath was coming in gasps, and the veins stood out in his forehead like blue and knotted cords. Even Umslopogaas, man of iron that he was hard pressed. I noticed that he had given up woodpecking, and was now using the broad blade of Inkosi-kaas, browning his enemy whenever he could hit him, instead of drilling scientific holes in his head. I myself did not go into the melee, but hovered outside like the swift back in a football scrimmage, putting a bullet through a Maasai whenever I got a chance. I was more use so. I fired 49 cartridges that morning, and I did not miss many shots. Presently, do as we would, the beam of the balance began to rise against us. We had not more than 15 or 16 effectives left now, and the Masai had at least 50. Of course, if they had kept their heads and shaken themselves together, they could soon have made an end of the matter. But that is just what they did not do, not having yet recovered from their start, and some of them having actually fled from their sleeping places without their weapons. Still, by now many individuals were fighting with their normal courage and discretion, and this alone was sufficient to defeat us. To make matters worse just then, when Mackenzie's rifle was empty, a brawny savage armed with a sime or sword made a rush for him. The clergyman flung down his gun, and drawing his huge carver from his elastic belt (his revolver had dropped out in the fight), they closed in desperate struggle. Presently, locked in a close embrace, missionary and Masai rolled on the ground behind the wall. For some time I, being amply occupied with my own affairs, and in keeping my skin from being pricked, remained in ignorance of his fate or how the duel had ended. To and fro surged the fight, slowly turning round like the vortex of a human whirlpool, and the matter began to look very bad for us. Just then, however, a fortunate thing happened. Umslopogaas, either by accident or design, broke out of the ring and engaged a warrior at some few paces from it. As he did so, another man ran up and struck him with all his force between his shoulders with his great spear, which, falling on the tough steel shirt, failed to pierce it and rebounded. For a moment the man stared aghast, protective armour being unknown among these tribes, and then he yelled out at the top of his voice, "They are devils! Bewitched! Bewitched!" and seized by a sudden panic, he threw down his spear and began to fly. I cut short his career with a bullet, and Umslopogaas brained his man, and then the panic spread to the others. "Bewitched! Bewitched!" they cried, and tried to escape in every direction, utterly demoralized and broken-spirited, for the most part even throwing down their shields and spears. On the last scene of that dreadful fight I need not dwell. It was a slaughter great and grim, in which no quarter was asked or given. One incident, however, is worth detailing. Just as I was hoping that it was all done with, suddenly from under a heap of slain, where he had been hiding, an unwounded warrior sprang up, and clearing the piles of dying and dead like an antelope, sped like the wind up the kraal towards the spot where I was standing at the moment. But he was not alone, for Umslopogaas came gliding on his tracks with the peculiar swallow-like motion for which he was noted, and as they neared me I recognized in the Masai the herald of the previous night. Finding that, run as he would, his pursuer was gaining on him, the man halted and turned round to give battle. Umslopogaas also pulled up. "Aha!" he cried in mockery to the Elmoran. "It is thou, whom I talked with last night, the Lygonani, the herald, the capturer of little girls, he who would kill a little girl. And thou didst hope to stand man to man and face to face with Umslopogaas, an Induna of the tribe of the Maquilisini, of the people of the Amazulu. Behold, thy prayer is granted, and I didst swear to hew thee limb from limb, thou insolent dog. Behold, I will do it even now." The Masai ground his teeth with fury, and charged at the Zulu with his spear. As he came, Umslopogaas deftly stepped aside, and swinging Inkosi-kaas high above his head with both hands, brought the broad blade down with such fearful force from behind upon the Masai's shoulder, just where the neck is set into the frame, that its razor edge shore right through bone and flesh and muscle, almost severing the head and one arm from the body. "Ou!" ejaculated Umslopogaas, contemplating the corpse of his foe. "I have kept my word. It was a good stroke." End of chapter 7. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information and to find out how you can volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Allan Quatermain by H. Rider Haggard. Chapter 8. Alphonse Explains. And so the fight was ended. On returning from the shocking scene, it suddenly struck me that I had seen nothing of Alphonse since the moment, some 20 minutes before, for though this fight has taken a long while to describe, it did not take long in reality, when I had been forced to hit him in the wind, with the result of nearly getting myself shot. Fearing that the poor little man had perished in the battle, I began to hunt among the dead for his body, but not being able either to see or hear anything of it, I concluded that he must have survived, and walked down the side of the kraal where we had first taken our stand, calling him by name. Now some 15 paces back from the kraal wall stood a very ancient tree of the banyan species. So ancient was it that all the inside had, in the course of ages, decayed away, leaving nothing but a shell of bark. "Alphonse!" I called as I walked down the wall. "Alphonse!" "Oui, monsieur," answered a voice. "Here am I." I looked round but could see nobody. "Where?" I cried. "Here am I, monsieur, in the tree." I looked, and there, peering out of a hole in the trunk of the banyan about 5 feet from the ground, I saw a pale face and a pair of large mustachios, one clipped short and the other as lamentably out of curl as the tail of a newly whipped pug. Then, for the first time, I realized what I had suspected before, namely, that Alphonse was an arrant coward. I walked up to him. "Come out of that hole," I said. "Is it finished, monsieur?" he asked anxiously. "Quite finished? Ah, the horrors I have undergone, and the prayers I have uttered!" "Come out, you little wretch," I said, for I did not feel amiable. "It is all over." "So, monsieur, then my prayers have prevailed. I emerge," and he did. As we were walking down together to join the others, who were gathered in a group by the wide entrance to the kraal, which now resembled a veritable charnel house, a Maasai, who had escaped so far and been hiding under a bush, suddenly sprang up and charged furiously at us. Off went Alphonse with a howl of terror, and after him flew the Masai, bent upon doing some execution before he died. He soon overtook the poor little Frenchman, and would have finished him then and there, had I not, just as Alphonse made a last agonized double, in the vain hope of avoiding the yard of steel that was flashing in his immediate rear, managed to put a bullet between the Elmoran's broad shoulders, which brought matters to a satisfactory conclusion so far as the Frenchman was concerned. But just then he tripped and fell flat, and the body of the Masai fell right on the top of him, moving convulsively in the death struggle. Thereupon there arose such a series of piercing howls that I concluded that before he died the savage must have managed to stab poor Alphonse. I ran up in a hurry and pulled the Masai off, and there beneath him lay Alphonse, covered with blood and jerking himself about like a galvanized frog. Poor fellow, thought I, he is done for, and kneeling down by him I began to search for his wound as well as his struggles would allow. "Oh, the hole in my back!" he yelled. "I am murdered! I am dead! Oh, Annette!" I searched again, but could see no wound. Then the truth dawned on me. The man was frightened, not hurt. "Get up!" I shouted. "Get up! Aren't you ashamed of yourself? You are not touched." Thereupon he rose, not a penny the worse. "But, monsieur, I thought I was," he said apologetically. "I did not know that I had conquered." Then, giving the body of the Maasai a kick, he ejaculated triumphantly, "Ah, dog of a black savage, thou art dead! What victory!" Thoroughly disgusted, I left Alphonse to look after himself, which he did by following me like a shadow, and proceeded to join the others by the large entrance. The first thing that I saw was Mackenzie, seated on a stone, with a handkerchief twisted round his thigh, from which he was bleeding freely, having indeed received a spear thrust that passed right through it, and still holding in his hand his favourite carving knife, now bent nearly double, from which I gathered that he had been successful in his rough and tumble with the Elmoran. "Ah, Quatermain," he sang out in a trembling, excited voice, "so we have conquered, but it is a sorry sight, a sorry sight," and then breaking into broad Scotch and glancing at the bent knife in his hand, "it fashes me sair to have bent my best carver on the breastbone of a savage," and he laughed hysterically. Poor fellow! What between his wound and the killing excitement he had undergone, his nerves were much shaken, and no wonder. It is hard upon a man of peace and kindly heart to be called upon to join in such a gruesome business. But there, fate puts us sometimes into very comical positions. At the kraal entrance the scene was a strange one. The slaughter was over by now, and the wounded men had been put out of their pain, for no quarter had been given. The bush-closed entrance was trampled flat, and in place of bushes it was filled with the bodies of dead men. Dead men, everywhere dead men. They lay about in knots. They were flung by ones and twos in every position upon the open spaces, for all the world like the people on the grass in one of the London parks on a particularly hot Sunday in August. In front of this entrance, on a space which had been cleared of dead, and of the shields and spears which were scattered in all directions as they had fallen or been thrown from the hands of their owners, stood and lay the survivors of the awful struggle, and at their feet were 4 wounded men. We had gone into the fight 30 strong, and of the 30 but 15 remained alive, and 5 of them, including Mr Mackenzie, were wounded, 2 mortally. Of those who held the entrance, Curtis and the Zulu alone remained. Good had lost 5 men killed. I had lost 2 killed, and Mackenzie no less than 5 out of the 6 with him. As for the survivors, they were, with the exception of myself, who had never come to close quarters, red from head to foot. Sir Henry's armour might have been painted that colour, and utterly exhausted, except Umslopogaas, who, as he grimly stood on a little mound above a heap of dead, leaning as usual upon his axe, did not seem particularly distressed, although the skin over the hole in his head palpitated violently. "Ah, Macumazahn," he said to me as I limped up, feeling very sick, "I told thee that it would be a good fight, and it has. Never have I seen a better, or one more bravely fought. As for this iron shirt Surely it is Tagati (bewitched). Nothing could pierce it. Had it not been for the garment, I should have been there," and he nodded towards the great pile of dead men beneath him. "I give it thee. Thou art a brave man," said Sir Henry briefly. "Koos," answered the Zulu, deeply pleased both at the gift and the compliment. "Thou too, Incubu, didst bear thyself as a man. But I must give thee some lessons with the axe. Thou dost waste thy strength." Just then Mackenzie asked about Flossie, and we were all greatly relieved when one of the men said he had seen her flying towards the house with the nurse. Then, bearing such of the wounded as could be moved at the moment with us, we slowly made our way towards the mission house, spent with toil and bloodshed, but with the glorious sense of victory against overwhelming odds glowing in our hearts. We had saved the life of the little maid, and taught the Maasai of those parts a lesson that they will not forget for 10 years. But at what a cost! Painfully we made our way up the hill, which, just a little more than an hour before, we had descended under such different circumstances. At the gate of the wall stood Mrs Mackenzie waiting for us. When her eyes fell upon us, however, she shrieked out and covered her face with her hands, crying "Horrible! Horrible!" Nor were her fears allayed when she discovered her worthy husband being borne upon an improvised stretcher, but her doubts as to the nature of his injury were soon set at rest. Then, when in a few brief words I had told her the upshot of the struggle, of which Flossie, who had arrived in safety, had been able to explain something, she came up to me and solemnly kissed me on the forehead. "God bless you all, Mr Quatermain. You have saved my child's life," she said simply. Then we went in and got our clothes off and doctored our wounds. I am glad to say that I had none, and Sir Henry's and Good's were, thanks to those invaluable chain shirts, of a comparatively harmless nature and to be dealt with by means of a few stitches and sticking plaster. Mackenzie's, however, were serious, though fortunately the spear had not severed any large artery. After that we had a bath, and what a luxury it was, and having clad ourselves in ordinary clothes, proceeded to the dining room, where breakfast was set as usual. It was curious sitting down there, drinking tea and eating toast in an ordinary 19th century sort of way, just as though we had not employed the early hours in a regular primitive hand-to-hand Middle Ages kind of struggle. As Good said, the whole thing seemed more as though one had had a bad nightmare just before being called, than as a deed done. When we were finishing our breakfast the door opened, and in came little Flossie, very pale and tottery, but quite unhurt. She kissed us all and thanked us. I congratulated her on the presence of mind she had shown in shooting the Masai with her Derringer pistol, and thereby saving her own life. "Oh, don't talk of it," she said, beginning to cry hysterically. "I shall never forget his face as he went turning round and round. Never. I can see it now." I advised her to go to bed and get some sleep, which she did, and awoke in the evening quite recovered so far as her strength was concerned. It struck me as an odd thing that a girl who could find the nerve to shoot a huge black ruffian rushing to kill her with a spear should have been so affected at the thought of it afterwards. But it is, after all, characteristic of the sex. Poor Flossie! I fear that her nerves will not get over that night in the Masai camp for many a long year. She told me afterwards that it was the suspense that was so awful, having to sit there hour after hour through the livelong night, utterly ignorant as to whether or not any attempt was to be made to rescue her. She said that on the whole she did not expect it, knowing how few of us and how many of the Maasai, who, by the way, came continually to stare at her, most of them never having seen a white person before, and handled her arms and hair with their filthy paws. She said also that she had made up her mind that if she saw no signs of succour by the time the first rays of the rising sun reached the kraal, she would kill herself with the pistol, for the nurse had heard the Lygonani say that they were to be tortured to death as soon as the sun was up if one of the white men did not come in their place. It was an awful resolution to have to take, but she meant to act on it, and I have little doubt but what she would have done so. Although she was at an age when in England girls are in the schoolroom and come down to dessert, this child of the wilderness had more courage, discretion, and power of mind than many a woman of mature age nurtured in idleness and luxury, with minds carefully drilled and educated out of any originality or self-resource that nature may have endowed them with. When breakfast was over we all turned in, and had a good sleep, only getting up in time for dinner, after which meal we once more adjourned, together with all the available population, men, women, youths, and girls, to the scene of the morning's slaughter, our object being to bury our own dead and get rid of the Masai by flinging them into the Tana river, which ran within 50 yards of the kraal. On reaching the spot we disturbed thousands upon thousands of vultures and a sort of brown bush eagle, which had been flocking to the feast from miles and miles away. Often have I watched these great and repulsive birds, and marvelled at the extraordinary speed with which they arrive on a scene of slaughter. A buck falls to your rifle, and within a minute high in the blue ether appears a speck that gradually grows into a vulture, then another and another. I have heard many theories advanced to account for the wonderful power of perception nature has given these birds. My own, founded on a good deal of observation, is that the vultures, gifted as they are with powers of sight greater than those given by the most powerful glass, quarter out the heavens among themselves, and hanging in mid-air at a vast height, probably from 2 to 3 miles above the earth, keep watch, each of them, over an enormous stretch of country. Presently one of them spies food, and instantly begins to sink towards it. Thereon his next neighbour in the airy heights, sailing leisurely through the blue gulf, at a distance perhaps of some miles, follows his example, knowing that food has been sighted. Down he goes, and all the vultures within sight of him follow after, and so do all those in sight of them. In this way the vultures for 20 miles round can be summoned to the feast in a few minutes. We buried our dead in solemn silence, Good being selected to read the burial service over them, in the absence of Mr Mackenzie, confined to bed, as he was generally allowed to possess the best voice and most impressive manner. It was melancholy in the extreme, but as Good said, it might have been worse, for we might have had to bury ourselves. I pointed out that this would have been a difficult feat, but I knew what he meant. Next we set to work to load an ox wagon, which had been brought round from the mission, with the dead bodies of the Masai, having first collected the spears, shields, and other arms. We loaded the wagon 5 times, about 50 bodies to the load, and emptied it into the Tana. From this it was evident that very few of the Masai could have escaped. The crocodiles must have been well fed that night. One of the last bodies we picked up was that of the sentry at the upper end. I asked Good how he managed to kill him, and he told me that he had crept up much as Umslopogaas had done, and stabbed him with his sword. He groaned a good deal, but fortunately nobody heard him. As Good said, it was a horrible thing to have to do, and most unpleasantly like cold-blooded murder. And so, with the last body that floated away down the current of the Tana, ended the incident of our attack on the Maasai camp. The spears and shields and other arms we took up to the mission, where they filled an outhouse. One incident, however, I must not forget to mention. As we were returning from performing the obsequies of our Maasai friends, we passed the hollow tree where Alphonse had secreted himself in the morning. It so happened that the little man himself was with us, assisting in our unpleasant task, with a far better will than he had shown where live Maasai were concerned. Indeed, for each body that he handled he found an appropriate sarcasm. Alphonse throwing Maasai into the Tana was a very different creature from Alphonse flying for dear life from the spear of a live Maasai. He was quite merry and gay. He clapped his hands and warbled snatches of French songs as the grim dead warriors went splash into the running waters to carry a message of death and defiance to their kindred 100 miles below. In short, thinking that he wanted taking down a peg, I suggested holding a court-martial on him for his conduct in the morning. Accordingly, we brought him to the tree where he had hidden, and proceeded to sit in judgment on him, Sir Henry explaining to him in the very best French the unheard-of cowardice and enormity of his conduct, more especially in letting the oiled rag out of his mouth, whereby he nearly aroused the Maasai camp with teeth chattering, and brought about the failure of our plans, ending up with a request for an explanation. But if we expected to find Alphonse at a loss, and put him to open shame, we were destined to be disappointed. He bowed and scraped and smiled, and acknowledged that his conduct might at first blush appear strange, but really it was not, inasmuch as his teeth were not chattering from fear. Oh dear no, oh certainly not. He marvelled how the monsieur could think of such a thing, but from the chill air of the morning. As for the rag, if monsieur could have but tasted its evil flavour, being compounded indeed of a mixture of stale paraffin oil, grease, and gunpowder, monsieur himself would have spat it out. But he did nothing of the sort. He determined to keep it there till, alas, his stomach revolted, and the rag was ejected in an access of involuntary sickness. "And what have you to say about getting into the hollow tree?" asked Sir Henry, keeping his countenance with difficulty. "But, monsieur, the explanation is easy, most easy. It was thus. I stood there by the kraal wall, and the little Grey monsieur hit me in the stomach so that my rifle exploded, and the battle began. I watched whilst recovering myself from monsieur's cruel blow. Then, monsieur, I felt the heroic blood of my grandfather boil up in my veins. The sight made me mad. I ground my teeth. Fire flashed from my eyes. I shouted 'En avant!' and longed to slay. Before my eyes there rose a vision of my heroic grandfather. In short, I was mad. I was a warrior indeed. But then in my heart I heard a small voice. 'Alphonse,' said the voice, 'restrain thyself, Alphonse. Give not way to this evil passion. These men, though black, are brothers, and thou wouldst slay them? Cruel Alphonse! The voice was right. I knew it. I was about to perpetuate the most horrible cruelties, to wound, to massacre, to tear limb from limb. And how restrain myself? I looked round. I saw the tree. I perceived the hole. "Entomb thyself," said the voice, "and hold on tight. Thou wilt thus overcome temptation by main force." It was bitter, just when the blood of my heroic grandfather boiled most fiercely, but I obeyed. I dragged my unwilling feet along. I entombed myself. Through the hole I watched the battle. I shouted curses and defiance on the foe. I noted them fall with satisfaction. Why not? I had not robbed them of their lives. Their gore was not upon my head. The blood of my heroic— "Oh, get along with you, you little cur!" broke out Sir Henry, with a shout of laughter, and giving Alphonse a good kick which sent him flying off with a rueful face. In the evening I had an interview with Mr Mackenzie, who was suffering a good deal from his wounds, which Good, who was a skilful though unqualified doctor, was treating him for. He told me that this occurrence had taught him a lesson, and that, if he recovered safely, he meant to hand over the mission to a younger man, who was already on his road to join him in his work, and return to England. "You see, Quatermain," he said, "I made up my mind to it this very morning when we were creeping down those benighted savages. If we live through this and rescue Flossie alive, I said to myself, I will go home to England. I have had enough of savages. Well, I did not think that we should live through it at the time, but thanks be to God and you four, we have lived through it, and I mean to stick to my resolution, lest a worse thing befall us. Another such time would kill my poor wife. And besides, Quatermain, between you and me, I am well off. It is £30,000 I am worth today, and every farthing of it made by honest trade and savings in the bank at Zanzibar, for living here costs me next to nothing. So, though it will be hard to leave this place, which I have made to blossom like a rose in the wilderness, and harder still to leave the people I have taught, I shall go." "I congratulate you on your decision," answered I, "for two reasons. The first is, that you owe a duty to your wife and daughter, and more especially to the latter, who should receive some education and mix with girls of her own race, otherwise she will grow up wild, shunning her kind. The other is, that as sure as I am standing here, sooner or later the Maasai will try to avenge the slaughter inflicted on them today. 2 or 3 men are sure to have escaped the confusion, who will carry the story back to their people, and the result will be that a great expedition will one day be sent against you. It might be delayed for a year, but sooner or later it will come. Therefore, if only for that reason, I should go. When once they have learnt that you are no longer here, they may perhaps leave the place alone." End note. By a sad coincidence, since the above was written by Mr Quatermain, the Maasai have, in April 1886, massacred a missionary and his wife, Mr and Mrs Houghton, on this very Tana River and at the spot described. These are, I believe, the first white people who are known to have fallen victims to this cruel tribe. Editor. "You are quite right," answered the clergyman. "I will turn my back upon this place in a month. But it will be a wrench. It will be a wrench." End of chapter 8.